The wind howled through the narrow pass of Thermopylae, carrying with it the scent of salt and iron. Before the clash of bronze and blood, before the arrows darkened the sky, there was a silence so heavy it pressed against the ribs of every man standing there. 300 Spartans, cloaked in crimson, shields polished like mirrors of the sun, stood shoulder to shoulder. At their head was Leonidas I, king of Sparta, warrior since youth, and the man who would turn a narrow mountain pass into a legend that would echo for thousands of years. Across from them stretched an empire so vast it seemed endless. The army of Xerxes I, great king of Persia, moved like a living sea. Infantry from 100 nations, cavalry like thunder, archers whose arrows could blot out the sun. The world had never seen such power gathered in one place. And yet, in that tight strip of land between mountain and sea, it would be held back by 300 men and their allies. This was not merely a battle. It was a statement, a declaration that some things, freedom, honor, duty, were worth more than life itself. The war did not begin at Thermopylae. It had been brewing for years, fed by pride, revenge, and the ambition of kings. The Persian Empire sought to crush the rebellious Greek city-states that dared defy its authority. Athens had already felt Persia's wrath. The memory of Marathon still burned in Persian minds. Xerxes would not make his father's mistake. He would not send a single expedition. He would bring the weight of the world. And yet Sparta answered with only 300. But to understand why Sparta would send so few, why they believed those few were enough, we must step back for the narrow pass of Thermopylae. We must leave the clash of empires behind and travel into the heart of the Peloponnese, into a land of harsh valleys and unforgiving mountains. We must go back to the beginning of Sparta itself. Long before the clash of Thermopylae, before kings like Leonidas I were born into destiny, Sparta was not yet a name that caused fear. It began as a collection of small villages in the valley of the Eurotas River, in the region known as Laconia. Unlike other Greek city-states, Sparta had no towering walls, no grand monuments to display its wealth. The land itself was its fortress, ringed by mountains, isolated, protected by nature's harsh embrace. According to legend, the city traced its bloodline to the hero Heracles. The Spartans believed themselves descendants of his line, inheritors of strength and divine favor. Whether myth or memory, this belief shaped their identity. They were not simply citizens. They were born of heroes that, in the 9th century BCE, a transformation began. The Dorian Greeks settled in Laconia and slowly consolidated power. They subdued neighboring communities, not through negotiation, but through domination. The most crucial conquest was that of Messenia, a fertile land to the west. The Spartans defeated the Messenians after long, brutal wars and enslaved much of the population, turning them into helots, state-owned serfs forced to work the land. This decision changed everything. With the helots farming and providing food, Spartan citizens were freed from labor. But freedom did not lead to luxury. It led to something far more extreme, total dedication to war. The Spartans knew the helots outnumbered them greatly. Fear of rebellion became a constant shadow. To survive, Sparta had to become stronger than any internal or external threat. And so, slowly, deliberately, Sparta reshaped itself. Its government evolved into a rare balance. 2 kings ruling simultaneously, a council of elders known as the Gerousia, and an assembly of citizens. It was a system designed not for democracy, but for stability and military readiness. Every law, every custom, every tradition served one purpose: to preserve the strength of the state. But the true engine of Spartan power was not its kings, nor its council that was its children. Because in Sparta, a boy did not belong to his family, that he belonged to the state. And the process that turned boys into warriors would become one of the most feared training systems in human history, in Sparta. Life did not begin with celebration. It began with judgment. When a child was born, he was not simply handed to his mother with blessings and joy. Instead, he was inspected by the elders of the tribe. If the infant appeared weak, deformed, or sickly, tradition says he could be abandoned in the wilds of Mount Taygetus. Only the strong were permitted to live. Whether every story of exposure is true or not, the message was clear. Sparta had no room for weakness. Those who survived infancy entered childhood unlike any other in Greece at the age of 7. A Spartan boy was taken from his family and enrolled in the agoge, the state-run training system that would shape him into a soldier. From that moment, he no longer belonged to his parents. He belonged to Sparta. The agoge was not merely physical training. It was psychological shaping. Boys were grouped into packs, supervised by older youths and instructors hardened by years of discipline. They were taught to endure hunger, cold, and pain without complaint. They were given little food and encouraged to steal, but punished harshly if caught. The lesson was not morality. The lesson was skill and stealth. They trained barefoot, even in winter. They slept on reeds they gathered themselves from riverbanks. They learned to fight in formation, to move as one body rather than individuals. The shield was not just protection, it was responsibility. A Spartan shield protected the man beside him. Losing it in battle was the ultimate disgrace. But there was something else, something less spoken of, that shaped them deeply: silence. Spartan boys were trained to speak briefly and sharply. What was valued, but long speeches were despised. This gave rise to the word laconic, meaning to use few words, derived from Laconia itself, the by adolescence. The training intensified. Mock battles turned into violent contests. Blood was not uncommon. Some historians even speak of the cryptia, a secretive practice where selected youths would venture into the countryside to hunt rebellious helots, reinforcing both control and ruthlessness. Whether exaggerated or not, it reflects the atmosphere of constant tension in Spartan society. By the age of 20, a Spartan male became a full soldier, though he would continue living in military barracks until 30. Marriage was allowed, but family life remained secondary. The bond between warriors was sacred. They ate together, trained together, and if necessary, died together. This system did not produce ordinary it produced something harder, colder, and terrifyingly disciplined. And yet, Sparta was not built only on the strength of its men. Behind the warriors stood another force, one often overlooked, but equally vital: the women of Sparta. Unlike the women of most Greek city-states, Spartan women were not confined to the home. They were expected to be strong, healthy, and resilient, because the survival of Sparta depended on it. From childhood, girls were trained in running, wrestling, and javelin throwing. They were encouraged to develop their bodies, for a strong woman bore strong children. Marriage in Sparta was unusual by Greek standards. Men lived in barracks and focused on military duty, leaving women to manage estates and households. Spartan women had more freedom, property rights, and influence than anywhere else in Greece. They could inherit land, oversee finances, and even advise on public matters. Their voices were not silent. They carried weight, for they were raising the next generation of warriors. It was said that Spartan mothers did not merely give birth, they forged soldiers. When a warrior left for battle, his mother might say, "Return with your shield," or on it. It was not cruelty, it was a creed. Life in Sparta demanded excellence, courage, and loyalty above all else, and women were key to instilling these values in both sons and daughters. Even the education of girls was designed with Sparta's survival in mind. Physical fitness was paired with moral education, loyalty to the state, courage in the face of adversity, and an understanding that personal desire was secondary to collective duty. Through these teachings, Spartan women became silent pillars of the military society, ensuring that Sparta's culture of strength persisted from generation to generation. And while the men trained for war and the women prepared future warriors, Sparta itself was growing. Its laws, its customs, and its very identity becoming more rigid, more disciplined, and more feared by outsiders. Yet this transformation did not happen overnight. It was a slow evolution shaped by war, politics, and necessity. To understand how Sparta became the unyielding power it was at Thermopylae, we must look at its conflicts with its neighbors and the harsh lessons learned from every battle and rebellion. The state's obsession with strength was born from both triumph and terror. Even as Sparta honed its warriors, the world around it was far from peaceful. From the earliest days of its rise, Sparta was surrounded by rival city-states and semi-independent communities, many of which chafed under Spartan expansion. To survive, Sparta had to master both offense and defense, learning lessons that would shape its tactics for centuries. The first major crucible was the series of Messenian Wars. The fertile lands of Messenia to the west were coveted by Sparta, but the Messenians resisted fiercely. The first war, beginning around 743 BCE, lasted decades, testing Sparta's patience and endurance. Villages were burned, armies clashed in brutal skirmishes, and the Spartan ethos of discipline and unyielding resolve was forged in fire. When the Messenians were finally defeated, many were enslaved as helots, bound to the land to serve the Spartan state. The Second Messenian War, roughly a century later, was sparked by helot uprisings. The Messenians had not forgotten their freedom, and the helots were equally determined. Spartan strategy evolved, no longer relying solely on brute strength. They developed formations, strict battlefield discipline, and a phalanx, rows of shield and spear moving as a single organism. The helot threat was constant, and it reinforced the idea that Sparta could never rest. Its citizens must always be ready for war. Beyond Messenia, Sparta clashed with neighboring Arcadian and Argive cities. Each campaign, though sometimes minor in scale, honed Spartan cohesion and adaptability. They learned to fight in terrain that favored the enemy, to endure hunger and fatigue, and to maintain unity under pressure. Every victory was a lesson. Every setback was a warning. Through these wars, Sparta also cultivated alliances, particularly with the Peloponnesian League. Other cities provided soldiers or resources in exchange for Spartan protection and leadership. Yet these alliances were fragile. Sparta's strength was never in diplomacy, but in fear and respect. By the time of Leonidas I, Sparta's reputation as a warrior society had spread across Greece. Every soldier knew the Spartan shield was not just metal. It was a symbol that few dared to challenge, and this reputation, built over centuries of blood and discipline, would ultimately draw the Persian Empire's attention, leading to the fateful events at Thermopylae. By the time Sparta reached the height of its power, its military was not just an army, it was a culture. From childhood through adulthood, every Spartan male was molded to fight, endure, and sacrifice. Training was constant, but so were rituals and ceremonies that bound them to one another and to the state. Each soldier's shield, spear, and armor were more than tools. They were sacred. Before battle, soldiers participated in ceremonies to honor the gods, especially Ares, praying for courage and unity. Music, chanting, and ritualized drills reinforced cohesion. A Spartan unit moved as one because from youth they were taught to think as one. Individual heroism was secondary to collective strength. The phalanx was an unbreakable wall of bronze and discipline. Even in camp life, the hierarchy and ritual maintained order. Older soldiers mentored younger men. Meals were austere. Lessons in strategy and endurance were constant, and every action reinforced the understanding that a Spartan's life was inseparable from the life of his comrades. Punishments were harsh, not only for failure, but for any act that undermined unity. Fear of shame was as powerful as fear of death. The warrior's ethos also celebrated courage and defiance. Legends of bravery, real and embellished, were told at every meal. A Spartan might fall in battle, but the memory of his courage inspired generations. These stories were not mere entertainment. They were tools, shaping young men into soldiers who could stand against impossible odds. This unyielding culture produced men capable of extraordinary feats. And when the Persian threat loomed, Sparta was ready. Its 300 warriors at Thermopylae were the culmination of centuries of training, ritual, and unrelenting discipline. A living testament to a city-state built entirely for war. But the Spartan system had secrets, shadows behind the glory. Not every Spartan thrived under the weight of expectation, and some fell through the cracks, creating tensions that even kings could not ignore. Sparta was unique in the Greek world, not just for its warriors, but for its government. At the heart of its political system was the dual kingship. Two kings from separate royal families ruled simultaneously, each with the title of archigetes, commanding armies and overseeing religious duties. One might lead a campaign, while the other remained in Sparta, maintaining order and authority. This dual structure prevented any single man from gaining absolute power, while ensuring that military and civic leadership were always represented. Yet kings were not absolute rulers. Above them stood the Gerousia, a council of elders composed of men over 60, many of whom were veteran warriors. The Gerousia proposed laws, judged criminal cases, and advised the kings. Their authority was formidable, their experience respected. Decisions were debated with careful calculation, and their approval lent legitimacy to Sparta's harsh but disciplined society. The third pillar was the Apella, an assembly of male citizens. Though it had limited power, the Apella could vote on proposals and elect members to the Gerousia. This system ensured that Spartan citizens, trained from youth to value the state above all, participated in governance, but always within the constraints necessary to maintain military supremacy. This balance of power created a society both rigid and resilient. The kings led the army to war, but their actions were tempered by elders. The warriors' loyalty to the state ensured cohesion, and the dual monarchy allowed Sparta to respond quickly to threats without succumbing to internal strife. The IT was this system, disciplined, tested, and refined over generations, that allowed Sparta to confront empires far larger than itself. By the time the Persian forces advanced, Sparta was not merely a city. It was a fortress of men, laws, and unbreakable culture. Yet even the strongest system has its vulnerabilities. Political rivalries, personal ambition, and the constant fear of Helot revolt always threatened to undermine Sparta's stability, a tension that would become critical in the years leading to Thermopylae. Beneath the glory of Sparta's warriors lay a hidden danger: the Helots. These were the enslaved people of Messenia and Laconia, bound to the land to produce the food and resources that allowed Spartans to devote themselves entirely to war. Yet their numbers far exceeded those of their masters, and their resentment simmered like a dormant volcano to Sparta's every law, custom, and training regimen was designed to control this threat. The agoge, the military discipline, and even the upbringing of women were all influenced by the need to prevent Helot uprisings. The Cryptia, a secretive institution within Spartan youth training, sent select young men into the countryside to monitor, intimidate, and even eliminate Helots deemed dangerous. This created a society constantly on edge, where vigilance was second nature. The fear of rebellion also shaped Spartan politics. Every king, every elder, every assembly decision was filtered through the lens of maintaining control. Sparta could not afford luxury, complacency, or leniency. Courage in battle was mirrored by ruthlessness at home. A failed soldier might be forgiven. A rebellious Helot never would. And yet, this fear had a paradoxical effect. It made Sparta stronger. It demanded unity, reinforced loyalty, and hardened both men and women against uncertainty and danger. By the time of the Persian invasion, Spartans were not only warriors. They were masters of tension, strategy, and endurance, capable of holding a narrow mountain pass against a vast empire. Still, for all their power and discipline, Sparta remained a city constantly balancing pride, fear, and necessity. The 300 who would face Xerxes were not merely soldiers. They were the product of centuries of struggle, a living embodiment of Sparta's triumphs and anxieties that be why the 5th century BCE, Sparta had become a symbol of military excellence and unyielding discipline across Greece. Other city-states watched with both admiration and fear. Athens, Corinth, and Thebes recognized Sparta as a force that could not be ignored. Its warriors were not only feared on the battlefield, they were respected as the embodiment of what it meant to live entirely for the state. Spartan influence grew through a combination of conquest, alliances, and diplomacy. The Peloponnesian League, a coalition of cities dominated by Sparta, allowed the city to project power without overextending its citizen soldiers. While the Helots sustained daily life at home, Spartan hoplites could march to aid allies, suppress rebellions, or confront foreign threats. Their reputation alone often deterred war, as potential enemies feared the unmatched discipline of a phalanx of Spartans. Sparta's reputation was reinforced by tales of courage and ruthlessness. Stories circulated of men who held entire valleys against overwhelming odds, of soldiers who endured hunger, wounds, and freezing nights without faltering. These narratives were passed from city to city, building a legend that was almost as potent as the soldiers themselves. Yet Sparta's rise was not unchallenged. Athens was emerging as a cultural and naval power. Corinth was wealthy and strategically placed. The Greek world was a network of rivalries and fragile alliances, and Sparta's militaristic approach often clashed with other cities' ambitions. The stage was being set for conflicts that would not only test the strength of its soldiers, but the very fabric of Spartan society itself. And it was this rising tension in Greece, combined with the distant threat of Persia, that set the path toward Thermopylae, where Sparta would face the ultimate test of its legacy. Far to the east, the Persian Empire under Xerxes, I was preparing a campaign that would shake the Greek world. The empire stretched from Egypt to the Indus River, a vast mosaic of conquered peoples and cultures. Xerxes, heir to Darius I, inherited not only territory, but the desire to crush the Greek city-states that had defied Persian authority. The memory of Marathon still burned in Persian minds. Years earlier, a much smaller Persian force had been repelled by the Athenians, a humiliating setback that Xerxes would not tolerate. This time, he would not rely on a single expedition or a limited force. He gathered hundreds of thousands of troops from across his empire, cavalry from Asia, archers from Syria, chariots from Egypt, and infantry from countless other provinces. The Persian campaign was not only a test of military might, but of logistics, engineering, and ambition. Bridges were built across rivers, causeways extended over marshes, and supply lines stretched for hundreds of miles. Ships transported thousands of men along the coast. Every detail was planned to ensure that when the Persians arrived in Greece, no obstacle would stand in their way. Meanwhile, news of the Persian advance reached Sparta and its allies. Though many Greek city-states feared the empire's might, Sparta responded differently. The state's very identity revolved around war, and its warriors were trained for exactly this kind of confrontation. Leaders like Leonidas, I understood that their role was not just to fight, but to hold the line, to inspire, and to prove that even a small force could resist a seemingly unstoppable enemy. Thermopylae, a narrow mountain pass where the mountains met the sea, was chosen as the stage for this defiance. It was a place where numbers mattered less than discipline, courage, and strategy. A place where 300 Spartans could stand against the tide. But before the final march to Thermopylae, Sparta's king had to gather allies, assess threats, and prepare men who had been trained for a lifetime for exactly this moment. And in this preparation, stories of loyalty, sacrifice, and subtle strategy would emerge. Stories that history would remember long after the swords fell silent. As Xerxes' army approached, Sparta could not stand alone. Though its warriors were unmatched in skill and discipline, they were vastly outnumbered. Leonidas, I understood that alliances would be critical, not only for military strength, but for the unity of the Greek city-states, which often distrusted one another fiercely. Sparta sent envoys across the Peloponnese, calling on allies to join the stand at Thermopylae. Soldiers arrived from Corinth, Thebes, and other cities, each bringing their own fighting styles, armor, and weapons. Though some were eager to fight, others were reluctant, wary of confronting Persia's enormous force. Tensions simmered even as banners were raised and plans drawn. Every alliance had its conditions, every troop its pride. Leonidas navigated this delicate diplomacy with the same precision he would later show on the battlefield. He appealed to honor, shared tales of Persian cruelty, and reminded the Greek states that the survival of their independence depended on standing together. Even as arguments flared, a fragile coalition began to form. A mix of seasoned warriors, local militias, and a few volunteers willing to risk everything. Meanwhile, scouts and spies moved constantly. The Persian forces were immense, but not flawless. Knowledge of terrain, weather, and enemy movements became as vital as strength in combat. Leonidas emphasized intelligence gathering, sending runners along mountain paths, listening for whispers in villages, and preparing contingencies for every possible scenario. By the time the first skirmishes began, the narrow pass of Thermopylae was alive with tension. 300 Spartans, bolstered by several thousand allies, waited in formation. Every soldier knew that they faced a storm of steel and arrow. Yet there was also resolve, a quiet confidence rooted in years of training, discipline, and faith in each other. In the days that followed, the stage was set. Thermopylae would not merely be a battlefield. It would become a crucible where the lessons of centuries of Spartan culture, training, and strategy would be tested against the might of an empire. The morning air at Thermopylae was thick with anticipation. The Persian army advanced like a living tide, their numbers so vast that the horizon seemed to ripple with men and horses. Yet in the narrow pass, their advantage was muted. The mountains pressed close and the sea hemmed them in, leaving little room for their vast formations to maneuver. Leonidas positioned his men in tight phalanx formations, shields overlapping, spears bristling like a wall of iron. Each soldier knew his place, his role, and the importance of the man beside him. The Spartans were few, but they were united, disciplined, and trained to hold even against impossible odds. The first wave of Persian attacks tested them immediately. Cavalry struck at the edges, but the terrain forced them into narrow lanes where the Spartans' shorter but stronger spears and tightly packed shields held firm. Archers rained arrows from behind, yet Spartans used their shields not only defensively but to advance, pushing enemy lines back step by step. The Greek allies, inspired by Spartan courage, held their positions as best they could. The clash was brutal and chaotic. Men shouted, metal rang on metal, and the ground trembled under the weight of thousands of soldiers. Despite being outnumbered, the Spartans inflicted heavy casualties, their tactics turning the pass itself into a force multiplier. Even as the battle raged, Leonidas moved among his men, calm and commanding. His presence alone steadied nerves and reinforced discipline. Every man understood the stakes. Retreat was shame, failure was unacceptable, and the enemy must not pass. Though victory was impossible in the long term, the initial success shocked the Persians. Their immense numbers could not easily crush the Spartan wall, and the narrow pass neutralized much of their advantage. Thermopylae had already begun to earn its reputation, not merely as a place of battle, but as a crucible of courage, strategy, and unity. The Spartans knew that sheer strength alone could not hold back Xerxes' endless army. They relied on cunning, strategy, and the intimate knowledge of their terrain. Leonidas positioned archers and slingers on the cliffs above, raining missiles down on enemy soldiers attempting to scale the heights. Narrow paths became traps. Boulders were rolled into advancing lines, and sudden ambushes struck at Persian flanks. Beyond physical tactics, there was a psychological battle. The sight of Spartans standing firm, shields locked, spears bristling, struck fear into the hearts of the Persian soldiers. Stories of Spartan bravery had preceded them, and now they confronted the reality. Even the Persian generals were forced to pause, reorganize, and rethink their approach. Leonidas also used deception. Scouts would send false signals, leading enemy units into areas where the terrain was treacherous or where they could be ambushed. The Spartans feigned retreats in small skirmishes, luring groups of Persians into kill zones where spear points awaited. Every move was calculated to maximize impact despite their smaller numbers. This psychological edge was as critical as the physical one. The Persian army was enormous but unwieldy. It relied on overwhelming force. The Spartans, though few, turned discipline, strategy, and fearlessness into weapons. They slowed the tide of conquest, proving that training, courage, and intelligence could counter sheer numbers by the end of the first day. The Spartans had not only held the pass, but demonstrated the devastating effectiveness of a united, disciplined force. Yet Leonidas knew that more challenges lay ahead. Paths around the mountains could allow the enemy to outflank them, and the cost of standing firm would be immense. For 2 days, the Spartans and their Greek allies held the pass. Wave after wave of Persian soldiers crashed against their shields and broke apart like surf against rock. Even the feared immortals, the elite guard of Xerxes' eye, failed to shatter the Spartan line. Frustration spread through the Persian ranks. The great king watched from his elevated throne, expecting swift victory, but instead witnessing delay, resistance, and humiliation. Yet Thermopylae had a secret. Behind the main pass, hidden in the mountains, there existed a narrow path known to locals, a shepherd's trail winding through the hills. It was difficult, steep, and dangerous, but offered a way to circle behind the Greek position that a local man named Ephialtes came forward to the Persians. Whether driven by greed, fear, or ambition, he revealed the path to Xerxes. In exchange, he expected reward and favor. His name would become synonymous with betrayal for generations. Under cover of night, Persian forces began the silent march through the mountains. Torches were dimmed. Armor was wrapped to muffle sound. Step by careful step, thousands of soldiers advanced along the hidden trail, guided by a man who knew every stone and shadow. Meanwhile, at the main pass, Leonidas, I sensed something shifting. Scouts reported unusual movements. The forest above seemed restless. Though the Spartans had dominated the direct assault, Leonidas understood that numbers would eventually find another way to dawn. The terrible truth arrived with a breathless runner. The Persians were behind them. The narrow pass that had protected them was now a trap. The allies gathered in urgent council. Some argued for retreat, others for surrender. But Leonidas made a decision that would echo through history. He dismissed the majority of the Greek forces, ordering them to withdraw and live to fight another day. He and his 300 would remain. Not because they expected victory, but because Sparta had taught them that duty does not end when hope fades. And now, surrounded on both sides, the final chapter of Thermopylae was about to begin. The sun rose red over Thermopylae, as if the sky itself understood what was about to unfold. The remaining Spartans stood in full armor, shields polished, cloaks flowing in the morning wind. Around them were a small number of loyal allies, Thespians who refused to leave, and a few others bound by honor rather than command. Leonidas, I walked the line one final time. He did not give a long speech. Sparta did not believe in many words. He looked into the eyes of men who had trained since childhood for this very moment. Men who had been hardened by the agoge, by hunger, by discipline, by the constant shadow of death. They did not tremble. They adjusted their grips on their spears. Ahead of them, the army of Xerxes, I advanced from both directions. The Spartans widened their formation and pushed forward into the broader part of the pass, no longer merely defending, but attacking. If they were to die, they would die driving fear into the heart of an empire. The clash was savage beyond anything that had come before. Spears splintered, shield cracked. When their primary weapons broke, Spartans drew short swords. When swords dulled, they fought with daggers, fists, and teeth. Their discipline held even in chaos. They rotated the front line so the wounded could fight again. They protected one another with the instinct of brothers. At some point during the storm of battle, Leonidas fell. The moment spread like fire through both armies. Spartans surged forward with a fury that stunned the Persians, fighting desperately to recover their king's body. To leave him in enemy hands was unthinkable. Through blood and broken shields, they retrieved him, forming a circle around their fallen leader. Persian arrows began to rain down in dark waves, blotting the sky. It is said that when told the enemy's arrows would block out the sun, a Spartan replied, "Then we will fight in the shade." Whether the words were spoken exactly so matters little. The spirit was real. Surrounded, outnumbered beyond measure, exhausted and wounded, the last Spartans stood their ground. One by one, they fell, not fleeing, not surrendering, but standing. When the final Spartan dropped, Thermopylae was silent except for the wind and the distant roar of the Persian army moving forward. The pass had fallen. But something else had risen. Something far more powerful than a military victory, than a legend. And that legend would ignite all of Greece. When the bodies cooled at Thermopylae and the Persian army marched south, Xerxes believed the road to conquest lay open. The pass had fallen. The Spartans were dead. The path into central Greece was clear. But Xerxes did not understand what he had truly unleashed. Word of the stand spread faster than the Persian advance. Messengers carried the story from village to city, from harbor to hilltop. They spoke of 300 Spartans who had held back an empire for days. They spoke of a king who chose death over retreat. They spoke of men who fought even when surrounded, who did not break when hope vanished. In Athens, the story ignited something fierce. In Corinth, it stirred pride. Even in cities that had doubted Sparta's rigid ways, admiration replaced skepticism. Thermopylae had become more than a defeat. It had become proof that Persia could be resisted. The Greek world, so often divided by rivalry and suspicion, began to unite. Themistocles in Athens, a brilliant and ambitious leader, understood the deeper meaning of the sacrifice. If Spartans could hold the greatest army on earth, then Greece could win, but not by land alone. Athens turned to its navy. Ships were prepared, rowers trained, strategy shifted. Sparta, though mourning its King Leonidas, did not crumble. Another king rose to command. The Spartan machine continued, disciplined and relentless. The death of Leonidas was not weakness. It was fuel. Even among the Persian ranks, whispers moved like shadows. The immortals had been stopped. Elite warriors had died in great numbers. If 300 men could inflict such damage, what would thousands united accomplish? The following year would prove decisive. The Battle of Salamis. The Persian navy would suffer devastating losses. Later, at Plataea, Greek forces, Spartans among them, would deliver a crushing blow to Persian land armies. Xerxes' dream of conquering Greece would shatter. And though many battles followed, history would always look back to Thermopylae as the turning point. Not because it was a victory, but because it was a spark. But to fully understand why the 300 chose death without hesitation, we must go deeper into the Spartan mind, into their beliefs about honor, shame, and immortality through memory. Because for a Spartan, death was not the end, it was proof. To understand why the 300 did not retreat, why they did not surrender even when surrounded, we must step inside the Spartan soul. From the age of 7, a Spartan boy was taught one truth above all others. His life did not belong to him. It belonged to Sparta. Honor was not a decoration in Spartan society. It was currency. A man who showed courage in battle earned eternal respect. A man who fled carried shame not only upon himself, but upon his family line. Cowardice was worse than death. A Spartan who survived by retreat could be shunned, forced to grow a beard on only half his face, denied marriage, and treated as an outcast. Social death awaited the coward. But a warrior who fell in battle achieved something far greater than survival, that he achieved memory. Sparta did not build towering statues or grand monuments like other Greek cities. Its monuments were stories. Names remembered, deeds repeated at communal meals. When a man died bravely, his story became part of the state's foundation. Children heard it. Young warriors aspired to it. For the 300 at Thermopylae, death was not tragedy. It was fulfillment of everything they had been shaped to become. There is a tale, likely embellished but deeply believable, of a young Spartan named Alpheus among the final defenders. On the last morning, when the Persians had surrounded them, he supposedly asked an older veteran beside him, "Do you think they will remember us?" The veteran replied, "If we stand." That was enough. The Spartan worldview was built on simplicity. Endure pain, obey orders, protect your brother in arms, and never bring dishonor to your shield. Their red cloaks were said to hide bloodstains, not for vanity, but to prevent fear from spreading among comrades. Their hair was worn long before battle because, as they believed, long hair made a good man more beautiful and a bad man more terrifying. Even their burial practices reflected this philosophy. Only men who died in battle and women who died in childbirth were granted marked graves. Both had fulfilled their duty to the state. So, when Leonidas chose to remain at Thermopylae, he was not choosing suicide. He was choosing the highest form of Spartan success. Yet even legends fade, if not remembered. And after the wars with Persia ended, Sparta would face new challenges, rivalries, shifting alliances, and a future where its rigid system would be tested in ways even the Agoge had not prepared it for. Because victory over Persia did not mean eternal dominance. When the Persian threat finally receded and the great victories at Plataea and beyond secured Greek independence, Sparta stood at the height of its prestige. The name of Leonidas was spoken with reverence across the Hellenic world. The 300 had become a symbol not just of Spartan courage, but of Greek defiance. Yet peace did not bring comfort. Sparta had been built for war, structured around discipline, tension, and constant readiness. In times of external threat, its society thrived. But in times of peace, cracks began to show. Athens, strengthened by its naval triumph at Salamis under leaders like Themistocles, rose rapidly in power and influence. While Sparta dominated on land, Athens commanded the sea. Trade flowed into Athenian ports. Wealth increased. Culture flourished. Philosophy, drama, architecture. Athens began to shine as the intellectual center of Greece. Sparta watched with suspicion. The Spartan way of life rejected luxury and excess. Wealth was discouraged. Foreign influence was limited. Their iron currency was intentionally heavy and impractical to discourage greed. To Spartans, Athenian openness and ambition looked dangerous, almost corrupting. Tensions grew quietly at first. Alliances shifted. Smaller city-states were pulled between Spartan leadership of the Peloponnesian League and Athenian dominance of what would become the Delian League. The unity forged against Persia began to fracture. Home, Sparta's greatest fear, still lingered: the Helots. Earthquakes struck Laconia during this period, devastating parts of Sparta and killing many citizens. In the chaos, Helot revolts erupted again. Sparta had to call upon allies, even Athens, for assistance in suppressing rebellion. The humiliation of needing help only deepened Spartan distrust. The society that had produced the 300 remained disciplined, but it was becoming rigid in a changing world. Sparta had mastered the art of standing firm against invasion. But the coming struggle would not be a single heroic stand in a narrow pass. It would be a long, grinding war between Greeks themselves. And in that conflict, the legend of Thermopylae would both inspire and haunt Sparta. The unity forged in blood against Persia did not last. Victory had created a new question. Who would lead Greece? Sparta had the reputation. It had the discipline, the legendary warriors, the memory of Leonidas, and the stand at Thermopylae. Its army remained the most feared infantry force in the Greek world. But Athens had something different, something equally powerful. Under leaders like Pericles, Athens expanded its naval empire. Tribute flowed in from allied islands. Massive building projects transformed the city. The Parthenon rose above the Acropolis, gleaming white in the sun, a symbol not of discipline, but of culture, wealth, and ambition. Sparta watched all of this with uneased Spartan eyes. Athens was becoming too powerful, too confident, too independent. The Delian League, originally formed to defend against Persia, began to look less like an alliance and more like an Athenian empire. Cities that tried to leave were forced back into submission by Athenian ships. Sparta's way was different. It ruled through land power and fear, not naval dominance. It maintained order in the Peloponnese, but did not build monuments or seek cultural leadership. Its strength was simple and direct. The hoplite phalanx. Small conflicts began to erupt between allies of both powers. Trade disputes, border tensions, political interference. Each incident added fuel to the fire. The older Spartans, men who had fought at Plataea or remembered Thermopylae, urged caution. They knew the cost of war, but younger leaders saw Athenian growth as a threat that could not be ignored. Finally, in 431 BCE, the fragile balance collapsed. The Peloponnesian War began. This would not be a brief, heroic last stand like Thermopylae to it would be a war of years. Of strategy, of siege and plague, of pride and exhaustion. And as Sparta marched once more in a battle, this time not against Persia, but against fellow Greeks, the legacy of the 300 would hang over every decision. Because now, the question was no longer whether Spartans could die bravely. The question was whether they could win. When war erupted between Sparta and Athens, it was not fought in a single pass or on a single decisive day. It was a grinding contest of endurance. Sparta, master of land warfare, invaded Athenian territory year after year, marching into Attica, burning crops, challenging the Athenians to meet them in open battle. But Athens refused. Under the strategy shaped by Pericles, the Athenians withdrew behind their long walls, using their powerful navy to strike its Spartan allies by sea. It was a new kind of war, one that tested patience rather than courage in a single glorious clash. For Sparta, this was unfamiliar territory. The Spartan system had been designed for decisive engagement. Their warriors excelled in close combat, shield against shield, spear against spear. But now they found themselves fighting an enemy who would not stand in the open field. Years passed. Farms were burned. Cities were blockaded. Raids replaced pitched battles. Then tragedy struck Athens. Plague swept through the crowded city. Thousands died, including Pericles himself. Sparta saw opportunity. The war shifted again. Spartan commanders began to adapt. They strengthened alliances, built naval capacity, something previously neglected, and sought support from Persia, ironically the former enemy. Gold flowed into Spartan coffers to fund ships and crews. The transformation was remarkable. Sparta, once rigid and resistant to change, began to evolve under pressure. Yet even as they adapted, something subtle was changing within them. Long campaigns meant prolonged absence from home. Exposure to wealth and foreign lands tempted some Spartans away from their austere traditions. The strict equality among citizens began to erode as some accumulated influence and resources. The very discipline that had created the 300 was slowly being tested by time and circumstance. And as the Peloponnesian War dragged on toward its dramatic conclusion, Sparta would achieve victory, but at a cost it did not fully understand. Because winning a war is not the same as preserving a way of life. After nearly 3 decades of brutal struggle, the Peloponnesian War reached its breaking point. The Athenian navy, once the pride of the Aegean, was finally shattered at the Battle of Agaspotami by the Spartan commander Lysander. Cut off from grain supplies and surrounded by enemies, Athens starved. In 404 BC, the unthinkable happened. Athens surrendered. Its walls were torn down. Its fleet was reduced. Its empire dissolved. Sparta stood victorious, the undisputed hegemon of Greece. The city that had once resisted Persia with 300 men had now defeated the greatest naval and cultural power in the Greek world. In Sparta, there was celebration, but it was restrained, as always. No towering monuments were built. No lavish feasts were recorded. Victory, for Spartans, was not indulgence. It was proof of superiority. Yet beneath the surface, cracks widened. Sparta now controlled a vast network of former Athenian territories. Garrisons had to be stationed abroad, governors installed, tribute managed. This was new territory for a society built around local discipline and simplicity. Managing an empire required flexibility, diplomacy, and administrative skill. Quality Sparta had never prioritized. Wealth began to trickle back into the city despite old laws discouraging luxury. Some Spartan leaders grew powerful and influential in ways that threatened the traditional balance between citizens. Meanwhile, resentment brewed among other Greek city-states. Sparta had fought in the name of freedom from Athenian domination, but now many felt dominated by Sparta instead. The warrior state that had once stood united at Thermopylae was entering unfamiliar ground. For centuries, Sparta had thrived when defending its homeland or leading a coalition against an external enemy. Now, it was the dominant power, and dominance brings envy, fear, and rebellion. The legend of the 300 still lived in memory. But the Sparta of Leonidas had been lean, focused, disciplined, and united by necessity. The Sparta of victory was powerful, but stretched. And in the years ahead, new rivals would rise, testing whether Sparta's ancient system could endure a changing world. Victory over Athens should have secured Sparta's dominance for generations. Instead, it marked the beginning of its slow unraveling. Sparta had defeated one empire, only to struggle with becoming one itself. Garrisons stationed across Greece drained manpower. Citizen numbers, already limited due to strict requirements for full Spartan status, began to shrink dangerously. Land ownership consolidated into fewer hands. The equality that once bound Spartan warriors together started to fade. And while Sparta wrestled with internal imbalance, new forces gathered strength. In the north, the city of Thebes rose quietly. Once overshadowed by Athens and Sparta, Thebes began reforming its military. Leaders there studied Spartan tactics carefully, not to copy them, but to counter them. Sparta, confident in its legendary infantry, did not immediately perceive the danger. In 371 BCE, at the Battle of Leuctra, the unimaginable occurred. The Theban army, led by the brilliant general Epaminondas, shattered the Spartan phalanx. For the first time in centuries, Spartan hoplites were decisively defeated in open battle. The myth of Spartan invincibility cracked. The psychological blow was immense. Sparta had always relied not just on military strength, but on reputation. Fear had been its ally. After Leuctra, that fear diminished. Worse still, Thebes marched into Messenia and liberated the Helots who had been enslaved for generations. The agricultural foundation of Spartan society collapsed. Without Messenian labor, Sparta's economic and military system faltered. The warrior state that had once sent 300 men to stand against Persia was now struggling to maintain its own territory. Yet, even in decline, the legend of Thermopylae did not fade. It grew stronger. Because as Sparta weakened politically and militarily, its story became immortal. The 300 were no longer just soldiers of city-state. They became symbols of courage against overwhelming odds, of discipline in the face of chaos, of sacrifice for something greater than oneself. But history did not stop with Sparta. That a new power was rising beyond the fractured Greek world. One that would unite Greece not through alliance, but through conquest. And once again, Sparta would have to decide how to face a changing world. Sparta struggled to recover from its defeat at Leuctra. A new force was quietly transforming the balance of power in the north in the rugged kingdom of Macedon. A young prince had once lived as a hostage in Thebes. There, he studied the very tactics that had broken Sparta's dominance. That prince would grow into Philip II of Macedon. Philip was no ordinary ruler. He reorganized his army with relentless precision. He created the Macedonian phalanx, armed with long sarissas, pikes far longer than traditional Greek spears. He combined infantry with heavy cavalry in coordinated maneuvers that redefined warfare. Diplomacy, marriage alliances, bribery, and calculated force all became tools in his arsenal. While southern Greek city-states argued and weakened one another, Macedon grew stronger. Sparta watched from the sidelines. Unlike Athens and Thebes, Sparta refused to join Philip's League of Corinth after he defeated the combined Greek forces at the Battle of Corinthia in 338 BC. True to its nature, Sparta would not submit easily to outside authority. But its refusal was more symbolic than threatening. The Spartan army was no longer the unstoppable force it had once been. When Philip was assassinated, his son rose to power. Young, ambitious, and extraordinary. His name was Alexander the Great. Alexander would go on to conquer the Persian Empire itself, achieving what Xerxes had once attempted in reverse. The empire that Sparta's 300 had resisted at Thermopylae would fall to a Macedonian king who carried Greek culture across Asia. And yet, Sparta played little role in this new chapter of history. The world was changing. Warfare was evolving. Kingdoms were replacing city-states. The age of small, fiercely independent polis like Sparta was fading. But though Sparta no longer shaped the destiny of empires, its story, its identity forged in hardship and discipline, remained deeply embedded in the Greek imagination. The stand at Thermopylae had transcended politics. It had become legend, and legends do not die easily. Though Sparta's political and military power waned, its cultural and moral influence endured. Philosophers, historians, and poets studied its society with fascination, marveling at how a small city-state could create men capable of holding an empire at bay. The story of the 300 Spartans became a template for courage, sacrifice, and discipline, not just in Greece, but for the world to come. Even as Macedon rose and Athens rebuilt, Sparta remained a symbol. Soldiers and leaders from other lands emulated Spartan training, emulating the agoge and the strict discipline that had created heroes. Military academies centuries later would study their methods, and the notion of the citizen soldier in service to the state owed much to Spartan example. Spartan society itself changed slowly over time. As citizen numbers dwindled and wealth became more concentrated, the rigid equality of hoplites eroded. The agoge became less universal, and mercenary forces sometimes supplemented citizen soldiers. Yet the values, honor, courage, loyalty, remained etched in memory. Legends of Thermopylae were preserved in stories, inscriptions, and oral histories. The Persians themselves remembered the courage of the Spartans. Generations of Greeks would tell the tale of how 300 men, with a handful of allies, stood against the might of an empire. It was not the size of the army that mattered, the story said. It was the will to stand, the refusal to yield, and the willingness to sacrifice all for something larger than oneself. Even when Sparta faded from prominence, its ideas persisted. Leaders, warriors, and nations would look back to the stand at Thermopylae as a measure of courage, endurance, and the ultimate test of human resolve. And so, though Sparta's time as a dominant power ended, its legacy as the crucible of warriors and the home of the 300 remained immortal. While history remembers the 300 as warriors of unmatched courage, each man carried a story, a life before the battlefield. Some had wives they would never see again, children they would leave behind, brothers they had trained with since boyhood. In the cold nights at Thermopylae, whispers of home mixed with the clang of armor and the roar of the Persian army. One such warrior, named Demarian, had secretly promised his wife he would return before the next harvest. Yet now, standing in the narrow pass, he tightened his grip on his spear, knowing he might never see her again. His fear did not weaken him. It sharpened his resolve. Another, Lysander, not the later Spartan commander, prayed silently to the gods for strength, imagining his mother's proud gaze as he braced against the oncoming tide of arrows. Leonidas, too, was human. Behind his calm, commanding presence, he carried the weight of knowing the lives of his men were bound to his decision. Every choice mattered. Every misstep could cost dozens, hundreds, or even the lives of the entire company. And yet he smiled at moments of courage, whispered encouragement, and shared in the small triumphs. A fallen Persian pushed back. A comrade's shield saved another. A young Spartan standing tall despite exhaustion. These personal stories, lost to history, but imagined through the lens of human experience, remind us that the legend of the 300 was not merely bronze and blood. It was made of men who felt fear, love, and loyalty as intensely as they felt honor. Each life, each heartbeat, became part of the story that would echo for millennia. The battlefield was their world, but memory and imagination allow us to glimpse the men behind the shields. The ordinary men who became extraordinary through choice and courage. Among the 300, a young warrior named Theron had just completed his final trials in the agoge. Only 17, He carried the weight of his family's honor and the hope of proving himself to the veterans of the company. He had trained his entire life for this day, but standing in Thermopylae, he felt a pang of doubt. Could a boy of his age stand against thousands of seasoned enemies? On the night before the battle, Leonidas walked among the warriors. He paused before Theron, studying the young man's tense posture and wide eyes. "Fear is natural," the king said quietly, "but courage is choosing to act in spite of it. Tomorrow, you will see what a Spartan can do, not because of strength, but because of will." Theron nodded, swallowing his fear. That night, he wrote a message to his family on a small piece of waxed wood, hiding it beneath his shield. "I fight for Sparta and for you. If I fall, no, I did not falter." As dawn broke, Theron fought in the front line. He felt the sharp sting of Persian arrows and the clash of swords. But he remembered Leonidas' words. Step by step, spear thrust by spear thrust, he held the line. When an enemy soldier broke through beside him, Theron raised his shield to protect a fallen comrade, demonstrating the Spartan ideal. Courage paired with loyalty be why the end of the first day's fighting, Theron had earned the respect of the veterans. Though he was still young, he had proven himself, not because he survived, but because he stood firm, embodying the spirit of Sparta. Through fictional glimpses like Theron's story, we see that the heroism of Thermopylae was not only the work of kings or generals. It was forged in every man who held his ground, no matter his age or experience in the narrow pass. There was no room for hesitation or mistrust. Life and death hung on the strength of the man beside you. Friendships formed in childhood through the agoge now became lifelines. Two warriors, Nicandros and Callus, had trained together since the age of 7. They knew each other's fighting style, every twitch of muscle, every breath in combat. When arrows rained down and Persian soldiers pressed the line, they instinctively covered each other, moving as a single unit. Even among strangers, bonds grew quickly. Men from distant regions of Sparta or allied Greek city-states shared food, warmth, and whispered encouragement in the dark hours. Stories were told, some true, some exaggerated, of past victories of ancestors who had fought in earlier Messenian wars, of Leonidas himself facing dangers that now inspired them to endure. In these moments, laughter occasionally broke through the tension, a rare but essential relief. One soldier joked about the absurdity of training for years only to be met by arrows larger than some of their shields. Another sang a quiet tune from home, barely audible above the wind, reminding all of the world they were defending beyond the mountains. These bonds were not just comfort, they were strategic. A soldier who trusted his neighbor could fight without hesitation, knowing his life was protected. The phalanx thrived not only on discipline, but on the unbreakable human connections that bound each shield to the next by the time the final day arrived. These friendships had been tested to the limit. When Nicandros fell beside Callus, the grief was immediate, but so was resolve. The remaining warriors fought with the memory of their fallen comrades, driving them forward. Each death a reminder of the stakes. In this way, the 300 were more than soldiers. They were a brotherhood, bound by blood, sweat, and unyielding loyalty, a human chain that could not be broken even by an empire. Not all heroes at Thermopylae were Greek. Among the Persian ranks was a young soldier named Arash, barely 20, who had joined the campaign seeking glory. He had been trained to follow orders, to strike fear into enemies, and to believe in the might of Xerxes' army. But as he approached the pass, he saw something he did not expect. 300 Spartans, small in number, stood in perfect formation. Their shields were locked, spears bristling like the teeth of some unstoppable beast. They did not flee. They did not falter. Even as arrows rained from Persian archers, the men held their ground, advancing forward in unison. Arash was awestruck. He had trained for years to fight fearlessly. Yet these men radiated something beyond skill, pure resolve, an unshakable courage that made him question his own loyalty. Every Persian he attacked seemed to meet the same wall of bronze. Every advance repelled, every surge blunted. That night, while the Persian camp slept, Arash thought of the Spartans' determination. He wondered how men could face certain death so calmly. It made him reflect on his own life, on the fleeting nature of glory, and on the difference between fighting because one is told to and fighting because one believes in something greater than oneself. The next day, Arash saw the Spartans still standing despite the overwhelming numbers pressing from all sides. And though he remained a soldier in Xerxes' army, a seed of respect and even fear had been planted in his heart. Through Arash's eyes, we glimpse how Thermopylae was not only a battle, but a demonstration of human spirit. Even enemies recognized it. Even foes could not ignore the extraordinary courage of the 300. The narrow pass of Thermopylae was more than a battlefield. It was a weapon. Sandwiched between steep cliffs and the coastline, it prevented Xerxes' overwhelming numbers from overwhelming the Spartan line. The Persians could not deploy their cavalry effectively. Their chariots were useless, and their larger formations became unwieldy. Leonidas understood the terrain intimately. Scouts had studied every slope, every ridge, every path that could be exploited. Small groups of archers were stationed on cliffs above, raining arrows on soldiers attempting to flank the line. Boulders were pushed down steep inclines, crushing troops who tried to ascend. Muddy sections slowed enemy movements, channeling them exactly where the Spartans wanted. The phalanx itself became an extension of the terrain. Spear tips, shields, and coordinated formations created an almost impenetrable barrier, turning the narrow strip of land into a choke point. Persian soldiers, confident in their numbers, found themselves funneled into traps, unable to fully use their advantage. Even the weather played a role. Occasional rain slicked the rocks, making movement treacherous for heavily armored soldiers. Spartans, accustomed to harsh training and mountain terrain, moved with confidence, while the enemy slipped and fell. Every aspect of the land had been studied, every weakness exploited. This mastery of terrain was a key reason the Spartans held for days, despite facing thousands of Persian soldiers. It was not merely courage that slowed the empire. It was strategy, intelligence, and a profound understanding of the battlefield itself. The story of Thermopylae is often remembered for bravery, but it was also a triumph of tactical genius, honed over years of preparation and combined with the indomitable will of the 300. Among the Spartan defenders was a man named Callias, trained not only in combat, but in stealth and observation. Before the final day, Leonidas had sent him up the cliffs to watch the Persian encampments, to note troop movements, and to identify weak points. Callias moved silently among rocks and shadows, listening to conversations, watching officers give orders, and noting unusual activity. It was Callias who first noticed the signs of betrayal. A small contingent of Persian guides moved through the mountains at night, carrying torches and maps. Something about their cautious but deliberate path struck him as unnatural. Returning to Leonidas, he whispered his warning. A hidden route was being revealed. This intelligence changed everything. Leonidas called an emergency council with his captains. They realized that the narrow pass could soon be outflanked. It was a moment of grim clarity. The 300 would face enemies not just ahead, but behind them. Yet, even with this knowledge, retreat was not an option for the Spartans. Honor, duty, and the fate of Greece demanded they stand. Callias' reconnaissance allowed them to prepare for the flanking assault, positioning soldiers to slow the enemy and protect as many comrades as possible. In the heat of battle, his actions saved lives, though it could not save all. Callias' courage and intelligence reflected the broader truth of Thermopylae. The Spartans were not only strong and brave, they were disciplined, cunning, and prepared for every eventuality. Even in fiction, these personal acts highlight how the triumph of the 300 was as much about strategy and foresight as about raw courage. The dawn of the final day broke over Thermopylae with a crimson light that seemed almost to presage the coming slaughter. A cold wind whipped through the narrow pass, carrying the distant murmurs of Xerxes' immense army. The Spartans stood silently, shields locked, spears bristling, their crimson cloaks darkened by the mud and dust of the previous days. The weight of inevitability pressed on every man, but still they held. Leonidas walked the line one last time. Each soldier he passed was a story, a life, a family, a promise. He lingered over a few younger warriors, his eyes sharp but compassionate. "Remember who you are," he said quietly. "Remember Sparta. Remember your brothers beside you. We stand together. We fall together, but we do not yield." There was no hesitation in his voice, no doubt, and in that moment, every man's fear transformed into focus, into resolve that ran deeper than any personal survival instinct. The Persians struck with renewed fury, having discovered the hidden mountain path thanks to the betrayal of Ephialtes. Thousands poured down from above, closing the Spartans in a deadly pincer. From the cliffs, archers and slingers unleashed a storm of death, while from the front, a flood of infantry pressed relentlessly. Thermopylae became a living furnace of war. Spears shattered against shields, screams echoed off the rocks, and the ground itself trembled beneath the weight of hundreds of soldiers. Even in the chaos, Spartan discipline remained terrifyingly precise. Men rotated positions in the phalanx to give others brief moments to recover. Shields were held firmly, spears thrust in perfect unison, and fallen comrades were shielded by neighbors whenever possible. No Spartan acted alone. Every movement was part of a collective machine designed to resist an impossible force. Theron, the young warrior who had proven himself days before, fought alongside veterans. He ducked beneath arrows, parried blows, and pushed forward despite exhaustion. Beside him, Demarian and Nicandros, imagined faces of human courage, stood shoulder to shoulder, their loyalty unbreakable. When a Persian soldier attempted to flank them, they countered as one, striking down the enemy in a flurry of steel. Above them, Callias, the Spartan spy, watched the unfolding battle from the cliffs, silently signaling to those below where waves of Persians would press hardest. His actions allowed small gaps to be reinforced just in time, prolonging the stand for hours beyond what the Persian commanders had anticipated, and Leonidas, in the thick of it, became both shield and spear for his men. He moved with a terrifying calm, striking down enemy soldiers with precision, rallying those around him, and inspiring courage simply by standing unbowed. It is said that when arrows blotted out the sun, a Spartan cried out, "Then we fight in the shade," a sentiment that captured the unyielding resolve of every man there. As hours passed, the inevitable began to unfold. Men fell one by one, yet the line did not break. Every death was met with vengeance. Every fallen comrade a reason to fight harder. The pass became littered with shields, broken spears, and bodies. Yet the surviving Spartans pushed forward, a wall of bronze and crimson that by midday, Leonidas himself was struck, surrounded, exhausted, and facing enemies on every side. He fell, his life ending amidst the very phalanx he had led into legend. But even in death, the impact of his leadership remained. The Spartans continued to fight around his body, holding their ground as long as possible, each man determined that the sacrifice of their king would not be in vain. Thermopylae became more than a battlefield that day. It was a crucible of courage, loyalty, and human endurance. Every scream, every clash of steel, every arrow fired became part of a story that would echo for millennia. A story not just of death, but of devotion, unity, and the extraordinary power of the human spirit when bound by purpose and honor. Even the Persian soldiers could not help but feel awe. Young Arash, the fictional observer, watched the final moments, realizing that courage was more than numbers, that resolve could turn a handful of men into legends capable of inspiring generations. Evening. Thermopylae was silent, the Spartans fallen. Yet in that silence was the birth of a story far greater than victory or defeat. A story of immortality through memory, courage, and sacrifice. When the dust settled over Thermopylae, the Persian army advanced southward, thinking the path to Athens now clear. Yet something had shifted, something invisible but powerful. Across Greece, news of the 300's stand spread like wildfire. Messengers ran through villages, across hills, and into city-states, carrying tales of unyielding courage. Even those who had not fought were moved. They could feel the weight of what had occurred at the narrow pass. In Athens, the story ignited determination. Themistocles used the Spartan sacrifice to rally the city's people. He reminded them that while Sparta had held the pass, Athens' navy could turn the tide elsewhere. Soldiers trained harder, rowers practiced relentlessly, and the Athenians prepared for the naval battles that would define the war. Meanwhile, among the Persian ranks, young Arash walked among the dead and dying. He saw the sheer bravery of men who had refused to yield even when surrounded. Every fallen Spartan became a symbol, every shield left on the ground a testament to discipline and unity. Arash felt awe, fear, and an unfamiliar pang of humility. Xerxes' immense army had been slowed, humiliated even, by a handful of determined men. For the first time, the invincibility of the Persian Empire felt fragile. Back at Thermopylae, the surviving Greek allies, mostly Thespians and a few others, retrieved the dead where possible and honored them with burial rites. They knew that the Spartan code demanded no man be forgotten, no life lost without respect. Leonidas' body was eventually returned to Sparta. His family, the kingship, and the citizens mourned, but they also celebrated his courage. Stories of his final moments, his calm in the storm of arrows, and his leadership under impossible odds spread quickly. Even the terrain seemed to remember. The pass, once the site of intense struggle, became a symbol, narrow, confined, and formidable, representing how a small, determined force could resist a vast empire. Future generations would study it, train in similar formations, and tell stories of how the mountains themselves had become part of the defense. Thermopylae had failed as a military defense. It could not stop Xerxes' advance. But it succeeded in something far greater. It inspired unity, courage, and strategy across the Greek world. Without the stand of the 300, Athens might not have endured. The Greek city-states might not have united at Salamis, and Persia's dreams might have gone unchallenged. And in the hearts of every Greek soldier, from Spartan to Athenian, the memory of Thermopylae became eternal. A reminder that bravery and discipline could turn the tide of history, even against impossible odds. Even as the Persian threat faded, life in Sparta remained shaped by war. The Agoge continued to mold boys into warriors, but now the stories of Thermopylae were woven into every lesson. Young boys were taught of Leonidas' courage, and the 300 who stood against the Persian tide. In the training fields, instructors would often pause mid-drill and recount how a single Spartan's resolve could change the course of history. How discipline and loyalty to one's brothers were worth more than life itself. At home, Spartan families observed strict routines. Fathers and older brothers often returned from campaigns to speak of courage, strategy, and the weight of duty. Mothers reminded sons of honor and shame, recounting the stories of those who had fallen at Thermopylae. Unlike Athens, which celebrated art, philosophy, and civic debate, Spartan culture revolved around survival, endurance, and reputation. Even marriage and childbirth were linked to the state. Women were trained to be strong, raising sons capable of carrying the city's legacy, while men were groomed to fight and protect the polis. Yet not all was rigid order. Behind closed doors, human stories persisted. A widowed mother mourned her son, the youngest of the 300, writing letters she would never send but reciting his deeds to anyone who would listen. A young couple, newly married, whispered hopes of a future free from constant war, knowing that their happiness was fragile and contingent on survival. Veterans like Demarian returned from campaigns and found themselves haunted not by fear, but by memory. The memory of brothers lost, of screaming arrows, of cliffs slick with blood. Politically, Sparta faced challenges. The kingship remained strong, but internal divisions emerged as wealth slowly accumulated in certain families. Though the iron currency and strict laws were designed to limit inequality, loopholes allowed some citizens to gain influence and land, creating subtle rivalries. The ephors, the Council of Elders, worked to maintain balance, but the city-state was entering a period where rigid discipline and governance could be strained by human ambition and desire. The Hella population, the enslaved majority, remained a constant pressure. Though Sparta had used its army to suppress revolts, the fear of rebellion lingered like a shadow over the city. Every campaign drew away soldiers, leaving the countryside more vulnerable. Even minor disturbances were met with swift and brutal response. Stories, both true and exaggerated, circulated among the Helots about the 300 who had faced death with courage, reinforcing the mythic power of Sparta, but also fueling resentment among those who labored endlessly for their masters. In this mix of discipline, grief, and myth, Sparta remained unique. It was a city built for war, but defined by its values. The legacy of Thermopylae was not merely a tale of one battle. It became the standard by which all Spartans measured themselves. Boys trained, men fought, and citizens remembered, all in the shadow of a narrow pass where a handful of warriors had changed history forever. Even in moments of peace, the echoes of that battle shaped every Spartan choice. Every policy, every training session, every ritual of honor reminded them that the price of courage was eternal vigilance, and that greatness was measured not only by victory, but by the willingness to stand when all seemed lost. Though Sparta's political dominance waned after Leuctra and the rise of Macedon, its cultural shadow loomed large. Across the Greek world, city-states spoke of the 300 not merely as soldiers, but as paragons of human virtue. Scholars in Athens wrote essays on courage, strategy, and discipline, often contrasting the decadence of their own city with the Spartan model of austerity and self-sacrifice. Plays and poems immortalized Thermopylae, turning real men into archetypes of bravery. Even in smaller towns, storytellers expanded on the deeds of Leonidas and his warriors. Some tales were entirely fictional, adding whispered romances, heroic duels, or secret strategies, but they all carried an underlying truth. Courage and unity could defy overwhelming odds. Families would teach their children the names of Spartans who fell at Thermopylae, ensuring that bravery became part of their identity from birth. Among the fictionalized tales, one story became particularly popular. It told of a Spartan warrior named Philias who, during the final day of battle, had saved the lives of 2 Athenian soldiers who had been caught behind enemy lines. Though entirely imagined, the story symbolized the idea that Spartan courage was not selfish. It was dedicated to honor, loyalty, and the preservation of Greek freedom. In many ways, these stories were the first seeds of what would become the concept of heroism in Western thought. Even foreign observers noted Sparta's influence. Persian officers returning to their homelands carried tales of disciplined warriors who stood against impossible odds. Later historians, such as Herodotus, recorded these events not just as military history, but as moral lessons. The value of courage, discipline, and the willingness to sacrifice oneself for a cause greater than personal survival. Meanwhile, in Sparta itself, young warriors trained rigorously, inspired not just by duty, but by legend. The memory of Thermopylae created a feedback loop. Tales of heroism inspired soldiers to emulate their ancestors, and the presence of disciplined, skilled warriors reinforced the stories told across Greece. Every shield raised, every spear planted in the ground, became part of a living tradition, a cultural force stronger than politics, wealth, or territory. Even as Macedon and later Rome rose to dominance, the story of the 300 continued to inspire. From philosophers to generals, from poets to common soldiers, the lesson endured. Sometimes, the measure of greatness is not in the size of your army or the wealth of your city, but in the courage and unity of those who stand together against impossible odds. Thermopylae had become more than a battle. It had become an ideal, and Sparta, though diminished in power, remained immortal in influence. Night fell over Thermopylae like a shroud, cold and silent except for the occasional rustle of the wind and distant Persian patrols. The 300 gathered in small clusters, sharpening weapons, adjusting armor, and murmuring quiet prayers to the gods. For the first time in days, there was a stillness that allowed thought to creep in, a dangerous thing for men trained to act, not reflect. Theron, the young warrior who had proven himself in earlier skirmishes, stared at the distant flicker of Persian campfires. He thought of his parents, imagining them pacing the streets of Sparta, perhaps praying for him, perhaps thinking of his final moments. His heart ached, but fear did not dominate him. Instead, he felt a strange clarity. This was the purpose he had trained for, the moment he had been shaped to face. Beside him, Demarian recounted tales of earlier Spartan heroes, embellishing them slightly to keep spirits high. Even the greatest soldiers feared, he said quietly, but they fought anyway. That is why we will be remembered. His words were a mix of comfort and challenge, reminding every man that courage was a choice, not the absence of fear. Leonidas walked among them, silent but ever present. He spoke only to a few, offering guidance or reassurance, but his presence alone steadied the men. One of the older veterans, a man named Cleon, whispered to Theron, "Do you feel the weight of what we are about to do?" Theron nodded, understanding that it was not just a battle. It was a declaration, a final test of Spartan virtue. In quiet corners, some men wrote messages to their families, hidden beneath their shields or tucked into armor. These were not letters of despair, but of duty, reminders that they had lived and died as Spartans, that their courage would endure beyond their mortal bodies. Even in imagined moments of fear, humor surfaced. One young soldier joked about the absurdity of preparing for decades of training only to be cut down by a Persian arrow. Others laughed softly, the tension easing, if only briefly. It was the humanity of the men, their love, fear, and humor, that made their bravery tangible. That night, Thermopylae was not just a battlefield. It was a crucible of the human spirit. Every man present knew that by dawn, the world would either remember them as heroes or forget them in blood-soaked sand. And in that quiet night, the 300 chose to embrace their destiny, not as individuals, but as a brotherhood, united in honor, courage, and sacrifice. The hours before dawn were filled with precision, ritual, and quiet intensity. Every Spartan polished his bronze armor, tightened straps, and checked the alignment of his shield and spear. For the Spartans, preparation was not only practical, it was sacred. The armor was a physical extension of the self, the shield a symbol of the city and of comrades. A flaw could cost not just one life, but the line itself. Leonidas moved along the ranks, observing every detail. He adjusted the positioning of younger warriors, ensuring that the phalanx would remain unbroken against the expected Persian assault. Each soldier knew the strategy: hold the pass for as long as possible, protect each other, and fight without fear. Yet even strategy was secondary to the mindset instilled by Spartan culture. Discipline, loyalty, and courage. In one corner, a small group of men performed a ritual. They sacrificed animals to Ares and Artemis, calling upon the gods to watch over them. Prayers were whispered, not loudly, for they did not seek miracles. They sought clarity, focus, and resolve. Some warriors traced protective symbols in the dust, while others quietly muttered the names of fallen friends they would not leave behind unhonored. Food was minimal, a few olives, barley cakes, and dried meat, but it was eaten with reverence. Every morsel sustained the body for the immense strain ahead. Conversations were sparse, but when they occurred, they were laced with shared memories of training, earlier skirmishes, and lessons passed down from fathers and older comrades. These were the bonds that held the line, stronger than armor or spear. Theron, the youngest of the group, sat briefly with Callias, the Spartan sentry who had scouted the hidden path of the enemy. "Do you think we will die tomorrow?" he asked quietly. Callias looked at him, his face calm but weary. "Death comes for all, but courage is what they will remember. Stand with your brothers, and the world will never forget you." Theron nodded, absorbing the weight of the lesson. As night deepened, the Spartans finally rested, though few slept. Instead, they meditated, visualizing spear thrusts, shield rotations, and the advance of the Persian army. The young and old alike prepared their minds for what the body would endure, understanding that Thermopylae was not merely a battle, but a test of their very essence. The narrow pass, the looming cliffs, the distant Persian fires, all seemed to hold their breath with the Spartans. Tomorrow, every man there would face the ultimate challenge, and though many would fall, their courage, discipline, and unity would echo far beyond the mountains, shaping the destiny of Greece and immortalizing the 300 in legend. Though Thermopylae had ended in Spartan defeat, the legend of the 300 endured across Greece. Centuries later, in the kingdom of Macedon, young Alexander the Great studied the histories and legends of the Greek world. He pored over the accounts of Thermopylae, reading how Leonidas had held an empire at bay with just a handful of men, how discipline, courage, and strategy had amplified their strength beyond measure. Alexander was not born in Sparta, but he internalized the Spartan ethos. From childhood, he was trained in both military arts and philosophy, combining intellect with action, courage with strategy. His tutor, Aristotle, encouraged him to learn not just history, but the human lessons embedded in it. Loyalty, the psychology of fear, the power of legend. And Alexander became obsessed with the idea that a small, well-led force could achieve what even vast armies could not. When he began his conquests, this lesson came alive. At the Battle of the Granicus and later at Issus, Alexander faced Persian armies many times the size of his own. Yet he used tactics reminiscent of Thermopylae. He exploited terrain, concentrated his forces at decisive points, and led from the front, inspiring his soldiers to fight beyond their limits. Like the 300, Alexander understood that leadership was not abstract. It was a living presence, felt in every thrust of spear, every charge of cavalry, every movement of the phalanx. In a way, Thermopylae had lived again in Alexander's campaigns. The same principles, courage under impossible odds, unity in the face of chaos, and the psychological power of legend, were applied on a much larger scale. Alexander's soldiers, inspired by both his personal bravery and the stories of Greek heroes past, believed they could defy numbers, odds, and fate itself. Even his enemies noted the similarity. Persian generals whispered about a new Leonidas, a commander whose small, disciplined units struck where they were least expected, whose personal presence on the battlefield unnerved even seasoned veterans. Though history would remember Alexander for his empire, it is undeniable that the seeds of Spartan courage and discipline, those lessons forged at Thermopylae, helped shape his strategy and mindset. Thus, the story of the 300 Spartans did not end with their deaths in the pass. Their courage traveled across time, influencing a young prince in Macedon who would go on to conquer the very empire the Spartans had once resisted. Thermopylae became not only a legend, but a blueprint for greatness, a testament to the enduring power of courage, strategy, and unity. Alexander's mind often wandered back to the stories of Thermopylae, especially on nights when his army camped far from home, surrounded by hostile lands. In the quiet before dawn, he would imagine Leonidas standing against the tide of Xerxes' soldiers, envisioning the Spartan king's calm determination, his eyes scanning the battlefield, his men unwavering at his side. Alexander shared these stories with his companions and generals, not merely as lessons in courage, but as guidance for leadership itself. As the Macedonian army crossed into Asia Minor, the principles of Thermopylae became manifest. At the Battle of Granicus, Alexander faced a Persian army larger than his own, fortified with cavalry and heavy infantry. But Alexander's careful study of the terrain allowed him to choose the battlefield. He positioned his infantry along a riverbank, with the flanks protected by natural ridges. Just as Leonidas had used the narrow pass to nullify the numerical advantage of Persia, Alexander used the river and cliffs to channel the enemy into traps and focus his forces at decisive points. The Macedonian phalanx, armed with sarissas twice the length of Greek spears, advanced in perfect formation, while the companion cavalry struck with precision at the enemy's weaker points. Alexander himself led the charge, riding among his men with a presence that inspired absolute loyalty. He remembered the Spartan ethos. A leader must not simply command, but embody courage, standing in the thick of danger so that fear could not take root in the hearts of soldiers. His men, many of whom were still young and untested, drew confidence from his example, pushing forward against overwhelming odds. During the battle, a fictional moment of introspection occurs. Alexander, surveying the battlefield from the crest of a ridge, saw a young Macedonian soldier falter as Persian cavalry attempted to break the line. The young man's fear mirrored that of countless soldiers at Thermopylae centuries earlier. Alexander rode to him, steadied his spear, and whispered, "Stand with your brother." Courage is not the absence of fear, but the triumph over it. The soldier returned to the fight, and together with others, held the line. That small moment, though fictional, captures the human element that linked Alexander's army to the Spartans. Personal courage, reinforced by loyalty to comrades, could overcome the numerical might of an empire. After Granicus came Issus. Here, the lessons of Thermopylae were tested on a grander scale. Persian forces under Darius III vastly outnumbered Alexander, with tens of thousands of soldiers arranged across the plains. But Alexander replicated the strategy of disciplined focus. He concentrated his best troops at a decisive point on the battlefield, striking at the Persian center with cavalry, while holding the flanks with the phalanx. Just as Leonidas had chosen to fight in the narrow pass to maximize his army's impact, Alexander's tactical genius amplified his smaller numbers into an overwhelming force. Even in the midst of chaos, Alexander's imagination reached back to Thermopylae. He envisioned the Spartan soldiers rotating positions, covering for one another, standing unbroken in the face of death. He applied the same principle. His units would not act individually, but as one cohesive body, each soldier's survival tied to the strength of the group. And when the Persian lines finally broke, Alexander pursued Darius across the battlefield, ensuring that victory would be total and psychological, leaving no question about Macedonian dominance. Beyond tactics, Alexander internalized the moral lesson of Thermopylae, that legend and reputation could carry power beyond immediate military effect. By consistently leading from the front, by demonstrating courage and unwavering commitment, he inspired loyalty that outlasted fear, creating an army willing to follow him to the ends of the known world. His soldiers, like the Spartans centuries earlier, fought not just for conquest, but for shared honor, believing themselves part of a story greater than any single individual. Thus, the legacy of the 300 Spartans was alive in every Macedonian step, every spear thrust, and every charge of cavalry across Asia Minor and beyond. Thermopylae had transcended time, becoming a blueprint for courage, discipline, and leadership. Alexander's conquests, though far larger in scale, echoed the same core principles: unity, strategy, and an unyielding commitment to ideals. And yet, as the Macedonian army advanced toward the heart of Persia, there was an awareness among the generals, and perhaps in Alexander himself, that numbers, strategy, and heroism were only part of the equation. Just as at Thermopylae, the human element, the fear, courage, loyalty, and doubt within each man, would ultimately decide the outcomes of battles that would determine the course of empires. After Issus, Alexander's campaign moved deeper into the Persian heartland. Cities like Tyre and Gaza fell not merely through brute force, but through strategy, engineering, and relentless discipline. Alexander, inspired by the legacy of Thermopylae, treated every obstacle as a test of resolve, both his own and that of his soldiers. He believed that an army's strength was not measured solely in numbers or weapons, but in its capacity to endure, adapt, and remain cohesive in the face of adversity. In Tyre, the challenge was monumental. The city was an island, fortified with walls and defended by Persian troops and mercenaries. Siege warfare was unfamiliar terrain for an army that had so recently been praised for battlefield heroics. Alexander surveyed the situation and devised a bold strategy. construct a massive causeway to bridge the sea to the walls of Tyre. The work was grueling. Men labored day and night, exposed to enemy arrows, boiling oil, and the relentless sun. The physical strain mirrored the mental burden of facing overwhelming odds. A Spartan-like endurance test magnified thousands of times. Among the soldiers was a fictional young Macedonian named Calamenes. Calamenes had grown up hearing tales of Thermopylae, and he internalized every story as a standard for courage. Yet nothing could have prepared him for the day-to-day exhaustion of siege work. Muscles screaming, blisters raw, and dust filling every breath. Despite the pain he endured, spurred by Alexander's presence at the front lines and the belief that their collective effort could accomplish the impossible. As the causeway inched closer to the walls of Tyre, Calamenes realized that courage was not a single heroic act, but a sustained commitment over days, weeks, and months, a lesson straight from the 300 Spartans. Gaza presented a different type of challenge. The city's defenders were fierce, using the terrain to their advantage, forcing the Macedonians to engage in uphill assaults under heavy missile fire. Alexander, observing from the front, adjusted tactics continuously, repositioning phalanx units, ordering cavalry flanking maneuvers, and personally leading charges where morale waned. Every small adjustment reflected the strategic adaptability Leonidas had demonstrated at Thermopylae, making the terrain, discipline, and unity work for the smaller, dedicated force against a numerically superior enemy. During the campaign, Alexander cultivated both loyalty and psychological endurance. Soldiers were pushed to exhaustion, tested not only physically but emotionally. Some faltered. Some whispered fears of death in distant lands, far from their families and homes. Alexander would ride among them, speaking of courage, of legend, of Thermopylae, the story of men who had faced annihilation with dignity and unbroken resolve. These stories, historical yet elevated to mythic status in the minds of his soldiers, created a culture of resilience. Every man who heard them internalized a standard of heroism, understanding that greatness was measured not merely by survival, but by the willingness to stand unyielding in the crucible of danger. At T1 point, Alexander paused during the march near the desert city of Persepolis, observing the ruins of palaces and temples built by Xerxes' ancestors. He imagined the Persian king in his opulence, confident in his empire's invincibility, much like Xerxes had faced Leonidas centuries earlier. Alexander reflected on how a small, disciplined force, when united by loyalty, strategy, and courage, could challenge the mightiest empire in the world. It was a lesson he carried into every battle. An army spirit, once forged in courage and discipline, could overcome overwhelming material and numerical advantage. During the siege of Persepolis, Alexander allowed a fictional moment of human vulnerability. A young officer named Parmenios, exhausted from years of campaigning and constant danger, confided in Alexander his fear that even their legendary courage might not suffice against such immense forces. Alexander, placing a hand on his shoulder, recounted the story of Thermopylae, not to frighten him, but to remind him that courage was a choice, that the will of a determined few could echo across history. Inspired, Parmenios returned to his post with renewed focus, demonstrating the power of storytelling and legend as tools of leadership and psychological resilience. Across Persia, each conquest became more than a tactical victory. It was a demonstration of the enduring human capacity for courage, discipline, and strategic ingenuity. Alexander's army, though far from home and confronted with the vastness of the Persian Empire, repeatedly drew upon the lessons of Thermopylae. Each day's march, each siege, each charge of cavalry was both a literal and symbolic embodiment of the 300 Spartans' unbroken spirit. By the time the Macedonians approached the heart of the Persian Empire, the psychological and physical endurance of the army was tested to its limits. Yet every soldier had internalized the principle that defined Thermopylae. Honor, courage, and unity were more powerful than numbers, fear, or even death itself. Alexander's army was no longer merely an instrument of conquest. It had become a living reflection of the Spartan ethos, magnified across continents, battles, and time. The 300 Spartans had fallen centuries earlier, but their story now marched with Alexander across deserts, rivers, and fortified cities. It lived in every spear thrust, every tactical maneuver, and every whispered story told among soldiers during the night. Thermopylae had become immortal, not just as a battle, but as a standard of human courage that even the greatest conqueror of the ancient world could emulate. By the time Alexander's army reached Persepolis, the heart of the Persian Empire, the soldiers had marched for months across deserts, mountains, and rivers. The campaign had tested them physically, mentally, and emotionally. Many were seasoned warriors. Others were still young men carrying the weight of home in their hearts and the stories of Thermopylae in their minds. Every day of the campaign reinforced lessons learned centuries before. Courage under impossible odds, unity in the face of overwhelming forces, and the power of discipline and strategy. Persepolis was magnificent. Its walls, columns, and palaces gleamed in the sun, an awe-inspiring monument to centuries of Persian wealth and ambition. Alexander, riding at the head of his army, paused to take in the city, imagining Xerxes' predecessors walking these halls, confident in the invincibility of their empire. In his mind, he drew a line back to Thermopylae, imagining Leonidas watching Xerxes' army, seeing their size but refusing to yield. He understood the lesson. Even the mightiest empire could be challenged by discipline, courage, and strategic brilliance. As Alexander prepared for the assault, he walked among his men, listening to their fears and hopes. Many were weary, their bodies bruised and bleeding from long marches and constant skirmishes. Some whispered about the overwhelming odds ahead, comparing them to the impossible stand of the Spartans centuries before. Alexander encouraged them not merely with promises of glory, but with stories of Leonidas at Thermopylae, of soldiers who had held the pass despite certain death, of courage measured not by survival, but by the willingness to stand firm. Among the Macedonian army was a fictional soldier named Eryx, a young man who had heard the tales of Thermopylae since childhood. For Eryx, the stories had always seemed heroic but distant, until now, when he faced a fortified city defended by thousands of Persian soldiers. He remembered the lesson of the 300. Strategy and courage could amplify the power of a smaller force. Drawing strength from this, he led a small team to breach a section of the city wall, using scaling ladders while under fire, demonstrating that even the smallest units could shape the outcome of battle through courage and coordination. The assault on Persepolis combined ingenuity with relentless pressure. Alexander's engineers built siege towers, battering rams, and temporary bridges, mirroring the Spartan philosophy of using every tool and advantage at one's disposal. Macedonian archers, inspired by the unity of the phalanx and their leader's example, fired in precise volleys to suppress defenders. Cavalry units, echoing the mobility of Spartan auxiliaries, struck at gaps in the enemy's defense, turning defensive maneuvers into chaos. The battle was not won by brute force alone. It was won through discipline, coordination, and the moral power of leadership, a reflection of the lessons first learned at Thermopylae 18. The city smoldered with fires from siege engines and destruction. Soldiers gathered in small clusters, tending to the wounded, cleaning weapons, and whispering stories to keep morale high. Eryx sat with a veteran named Callistratos, who had fought alongside him since the early campaigns. They shared tales of Thermopylae, imagining the Spartans' last hours, and compared them to their own struggles. The exhaustion, the fear, the uncertainty, yet the unwavering commitment to their comrades. These stories became more than history. They became a psychological anchor, reminding soldiers that human courage could withstand even the greatest challenges. Alexander himself entered Persepolis with a small contingent, observing the city and its treasures. He understood the symbolic importance of the conquest. Persia's heart had fallen not simply to superior numbers, but to a disciplined army whose cohesion and morale had been forged through leadership shared hardship, and the inspiration of legends like the 300 Spartans. Even after the city was taken and looted, Alexander reflected on the human cost of war. Soldiers who had fought valiantly now carried memories of fallen comrades, some injured, others lost entirely. He honored them privately, knowing that courage in the face of overwhelming odds, like that shown by Thermopylae centuries before, was what would echo through history, not the wealth or the walls they had conquered. The story of Persepolis, as lived by Alexander and his army, became a continuation of the Spartan legacy. Courage and unity, forged in the narrow pass of Thermopylae, had traveled through time, informing the strategy, leadership, and ethos of one of the greatest military campaigns in history. Every soldier who raised a spear or manned a wall was participating in a living legacy, one that proved human will, discipline, and loyalty could shape history, no matter how vast the empire they faced. After the fall of Persepolis, Alexander's army pressed eastward, crossing rivers, mountains, and deserts. The army, though battle-hardened, faced new challenges: scorching heat, torrential rains, unfamiliar terrain, and logistical nightmares. Soldiers carried memories of previous battles, the scars, the exhaustion, and the ever-present fear of death. Yet, in the darkest hours of the march, many drew strength from stories of Thermopylae, told and retold by officers and veterans alike. The 300 Spartans, who had held a narrow mountain pass against impossible odds centuries before, became a symbol of enduring courage, reminding men that determination and discipline could transcend size and fear. Among the soldiers was a fictional young Macedonian, Lysandros, who had grown up on tales of Spartan heroism. At 16, he had been barely trained for the rigors of war, but the campaign forced him to grow quickly. On long, grueling marches, he reflected on the courage of Leonidas and his men. He imagined the narrow pass, the shouting of warriors, the rain of arrows, and the calm determination of the Spartans. Those mental images became his guide. When exhaustion threatened to break him, he would remember the 300 and stand taller, march longer, fight harder. Crossing the Hindu Kush and the Indus River, Alexander faced challenges that demanded not only military skill, but leadership and foresight. Supply lines were stretched to the breaking point, and many soldiers doubted whether they would survive the campaign. Here, Alexander's understanding of Thermopylae proved invaluable. He emphasized unity. No man could survive alone, and victory required absolute cohesion. He spoke to the army daily, reminding them that even when vastly outnumbered, disciplined men with strong leadership could prevail against impossible odds. In this way, the lessons of the 300 Spartans were applied not as mimicry, but as living doctrine, shaping both morale and strategy. That a fictional subplot introduces a soldier named Pythian, a veteran of the Granicus and Issus campaigns. Pythian struggled with fear and doubt during the march through the harsh deserts of India. One night, while the army camped near the banks of the Bias River, he confided in Lysandros. "I fear we march too far, that the land itself will defeat us," he whispered. Lysandros, remembering the Spartan ethos, replied, "The land does not decide courage. We do." Leonidas and the 300 held a pass against an empire. We cross rivers and mountains, yet the principle is the same. Stand with your brothers, and no army, no river, no mountain can stop you. Alexander's strategies in India reflected a direct evolution of Thermopylae's lessons. At the Battle of the Hydaspes River, he faced King Porus, whose elephants and cavalry presented a terrifying challenge. Alexander positioned his forces strategically, using the river and terrain to divide Porus' army and prevent the elephants from breaking the line. Phalanxes and cavalry moved in coordination, striking decisively at weak points, much like Leonidas had funneled the Persian army at Thermopylae. Even in the chaos of elephant charges and thundering hooves, Alexander's men relied on discipline, unity, and courage to hold the line. That the fictional moment shows Lysandros fighting beside his comrade Pythian during the battle. As an elephant charged, Pythian froze, panic threatening to overwhelm him. Lysandros pushed him forward, shouting, "Remember Thermopylae, Courage is a choice, not absence of fear. Together, they used spears and coordinated movement to redirect the elephant, saving their unit and exemplifying the timeless value of courage under fire. After the battle, Alexander honored Porus, seeing him as a noble opponent, and reflected on the power of human will. The Macedonian army, though battered, had proven that disciplined courage, unity, and leadership could overcome challenges far beyond numbers or weapons. Alexander understood that Thermopylae was more than history. It was a psychological template. Just as the 300 Spartans had inspired fear, respect, and awe in the Persian army centuries earlier, his army now inspired both fear and admiration in India. Through months of campaigning, Alexander realized that battles were as much about human will as about strategy or terrain. The mental and emotional fortitude of his soldiers, shaped by stories of the past, discipline in training, and leadership in the present, was the true engine of conquest. Thermopylae had taught that courage was contagious, that discipline multiplied effectiveness, and that leadership required both wisdom and presence. These principles carried his army across continents and shaped one of the largest empires the world had ever known. Even in moments of triumph, Alexander never forgot the lessons of sacrifice. He understood that the bravery of individuals, like the 300 Spartans, could resonate through time, inspiring generations beyond the battlefield. Every spear raised, every phalanx rotation, every coordinated attack was a tribute to the enduring power of human courage, a power Alexander sought to replicate in his conquest, in the hearts of his soldiers, and in the legacy of his empire as Alexander's army pushed deeper into India. They confronted challenges unlike anything they had faced before. Rivers swelled with seasonal monsoons, turning the terrain into a treacherous swamp. Thick forests blocked lines of sight, allowing enemy forces to stage ambushes. Disease ran rampant among men and animals alike, and the oppressive heat sapped energy from even the most hardened veterans. Morale faltered. Soldiers whispered about returning home, about families they might never see, about the impossibility of continuing the campaign. Exhaustion became more dangerous than any opposing army. It was during these grueling months that Alexander's leadership and the Spartan legacy became critical. He understood that physical strength alone could not carry the army. Mental resilience, unity, and a shared sense of purpose were equally important. He held long discussions with his generals, reinforcing the principle that every soldier's life was tied to the cohesion of the unit. A single man's fear can ripple through the ranks, he told them, but a single act of courage can inspire thousands. These words echoed the lessons of Thermopylae, where the courage of 300 men had delayed an empire, proving that disciplined bravery could shape history. Among the soldiers was a fictional veteran named Androcles. He had marched with Alexander since Granicus and had survived countless battles, yet India tested him like no other campaign. Each night, he slept on the ground, constantly drenched by monsoon rain, listening to the moans of men stricken by fever or exhaustion. Some nights, he thought of Thermopylae, not as history, but as a mirror of his own struggle. The 300 Spartans had stood, surrounded and vastly outnumbered, their courage transforming fear into resolve. Androcles used this story as a mental shield. Whenever despair threatened, he reminded himself that courage was a choice, that his endurance mattered not only for his survival, but for the unity of the army. The army also faced fierce resistance from local kingdoms. Tribal forces, skilled in guerrilla warfare, ambushed supply lines, attacked scattered units, and exploited the dense terrain to their advantage. Alexander applied lessons from both Thermopylae and previous campaigns. Scouts mapped the land meticulously. Units were kept in tight formations, and small contingents of elite soldiers were deployed to counter ambushes before they could escalate. Flexibility and discipline were essential, and Alexander emphasized that courage alone was not enough without coordination, foresight, and loyalty. The fictional moment highlights the human side of this ordeal. A young soldier, Myron, faltered during a river crossing, his pack heavy, his legs numbed from cold, and his resolve nearly broken. Seeing him struggle, a veteran named Parmenion, weary but steadfast, extended his hand and said, "Thermopylae was not about the strongest men, but about those who refused to fall. You stand with us, or we all fall together." Myron gritted his teeth, took the hand, and pressed forward. This small act mirrored the essence of Spartan unity. Courage multiplied through solidarity. Fear dissipated when shared and confronted collectively. As the army advanced toward the Hydaspes River, exhaustion was compounded by the sheer psychological weight of the campaign. Soldiers missed home, families, and the relative safety of earlier conquests. Some wondered whether the campaign had become hubris, whether they were pursuing glory at the cost of humanity itself. Alexander addressed these concerns personally. He reminded them that their actions, like those of the 300 Spartans, would be remembered not only for victories, but for their courage in the face of impossible odds, their willingness to endure suffering for a greater purpose. The fictional subplot of Lysandros and Pythian continues. Lysandros, now a seasoned warrior, guided Pythian through a flooded forest, teaching him to move silently, anticipate enemy movements, and trust both his instincts and his companions. Pythian's fear of failure mirrored the uncertainty that countless soldiers had faced at Thermopylae. Lysandros whispered, "Courage is not knowing you will live. It is knowing that your brothers depend on you to stand." Together, they emerged from the forest, having turned fear into focused action, a microcosm of the lessons the Spartans had exemplified centuries earlier. The march through India became a test of both body and spirit. Disease, terrain, and constant skirmishes pushed men to the brink of despair. Yet, just as Thermopylae had demonstrated, the combination of courage, discipline, and unity allowed them to endure. Alexander's presence, his leadership, and the stories of legendary Spartan heroism provided a framework for resilience. Every soldier internalized a truth, no matter the scale of the challenge. The same principles that had allowed 300 men to stand against an empire could guide tens of thousands through impossible adversity, by the time the Macedonians reached the banks of the Hydaspes. They were not just an army. They were a living embodiment of the Spartan ethos multiplied across continents. Exhausted, bloodied, yet disciplined, they had learned firsthand that courage is sustained through unity, that discipline transforms fear into action, and that leadership requires constant presence, empathy, and example. Thermopylae had become more than a legend. It was now a practical template for endurance, applied on a scale that Leonidas could never have imagined, yet still resonating with the same timeless principles of courage, honor, and sacrifice. The banks of the Hydaspes River were swollen with monsoon rains, turning the water into a swift, churning torrent. Across the river, King Porus and his army waited, war elephants towering over infantry, their tusks adorned with bronze, eyes trained to instill terror. Cavalry units patrolled the flanks, while archers rained arrows into the approaching Macedonians. The sheer size and unfamiliarity of the threat tested every principle Alexander had internalized from history and legend. None more so than the story of Thermopylae, where a handful of Spartans had turned terrain, discipline, and courage into an insurmountable defense. Alexander surveyed the battlefield, considering every variable. The river was both an obstacle and an asset. Crossing under fire could devastate the army, yet the enemy's reliance on elephants created vulnerabilities. If he could lure the elephants into restricted spaces, the phalanx could neutralize them, just as Leonidas had neutralized Persian numbers by funneling them into the pass. Every soldier was briefed on their role with precision. Infantry, cavalry, and engineers would operate in synchronized coordination, their success dependent on discipline and collective action. Among the Macedonians was Lysandros, now hardened by years of campaigns. He had survived battles in Persia, deserts, and forests, but the sight of elephants moving like living towers of destruction chilled even him. He remembered the stories of Thermopylae, picturing the 300 standing shoulder to shoulder, shields locked, spears bristling, knowing death was inevitable, but courage was choice. That mental image steadied him. If the Spartans could face arrows that blotted the sun, he could face beasts that reached higher than men. Alexander's plan was audacious. Using the cover of night, he moved part of his army upstream, crossing the river where Porus expected the Macedonians to be least prepared. He deployed skirmishers to distract and harass the elephants, while his phalanx prepared for rapid coordination against charges. Cavalry units, led personally by Alexander, were positioned to exploit any gaps. It was a complex maneuver, and success depended entirely on discipline, timing, and courage under impossible conditions. The battle began at dawn. Arrows flew over the river, meeting soldiers wading through the torrent. Elephants charged, screaming and tossing men like toys. The ground shook with the rhythm of hooves, and screams of terror mingled with the shouts of commanders. For many Macedonian soldiers, the first moments were sheer panic, until they recalled the Spartan lesson. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the mastery of it in a fictional subplot. Lysandros fought beside Pythian once more. An elephant charged directly at their unit. Pythian froze, panic taking hold, but Lysandros shouted, "Remember Thermopylae! Stand together! We do not falter!" Drawing on every ounce of courage, they and their comrades formed a tight spear line, using coordinated thrusts to drive the beast back. Their success inspired nearby soldiers, demonstrating that bravery was contagious, that unity could multiply effectiveness even against overwhelming odds. Alexander himself led a cavalry charge against the Persian center, exposing himself to arrows and spears. His presence inspired absolute loyalty. Soldiers fought with a fervor that defied exhaustion and fear. The Macedonian phalanx moved in unison, rotating and adjusting as porous elephants pressed forward. It was a test not only of physical skill, but of psychological endurance. Echoing the lessons of Thermopylae, discipline, strategy, and cohesion could allow a smaller, well-led force to prevail against seemingly invincible odds. Hours passed in a blur of chaos, noise, and violence. Rivers ran red with blood, elephants fell, and infantry clashed in relentless waves. Yet the Macedonians, guided by Alexander and motivated by the memory of heroes like Leonidas, held the line, adapted their formations, and pressed forward. Even soldiers who had faltered regained courage when reminded of the collective strength around them, proving that morale and unity were as decisive as weapons. By mid-afternoon, the Macedonians had broken Porus center. Cavalry struck the flanks, infantry neutralized the remaining elephants, and the psychological blow to the enemy was total. Porus himself was captured but treated with honor, a testament to Alexander's strategy, victory through courage, discipline, and respect. The soldiers, battered and exhausted, had faced death on a scale unlike anything in their experience, yet survived through cohesion, strategic brilliance, and the enduring inspiration of legends. After the battle, Lysandros, Pythian, and other survivors gathered by the riverbank, tending to the wounded and mourning the dead. The scale of destruction was immense, yet even in this, they found perspective. Thermopylae had taught them that courage was immortal, even in defeat. Every man who had fought, every soldier who had endured fear, had contributed to something larger than themselves, a living legacy of discipline, bravery, and unity that had carried an army across continents and into history. As Alexander looked across the battlefield, he reflected on the enduring power of human spirit. Thermopylae, the stand of 300 men centuries before, had not only inspired him, but provided a blueprint for leadership, courage, and cohesion. The Macedonian army, now tested in river, forest, and jungle, had proven that the principles of discipline, unity, and bravery were timeless. The Battle of the Hydaspes River was more than a military victory. It was a psychological triumph, a reaffirmation that even the most formidable obstacles could be overcome through courage, strategic thinking, and unwavering loyalty. The echoes of Thermopylae had not merely survived. They had evolved, traveling across time and geography to shape one of the greatest military campaigns in history. After the grueling victory at the Hydaspes, Alexander's army faced a different kind of battle, the struggle of survival, loyalty, and weariness. Months of campaigns in unfamiliar lands, relentless marching, harsh climates, disease, and unending combat had worn the soldiers down. Morale wavered, and whispers of dissent began to circulate. Many veterans longed for home, for the familiar streets and olive groves of Macedon and Greece. They had fought far beyond the limits of human endurance, yet Alexander understood that the challenge was now psychological. Keeping an exhausted army united, motivated, and disciplined out on the banks of the Hyphasis River, the easternmost point of his campaign, Alexander faced the ultimate test of leadership. The men, battle-hardened yet human, pleaded to return west. He could have pressed onward, risking mutiny, fatigue, and the destruction of his army. Instead, he made the decisive choice to turn back, knowing that courage was not only measured by the conquest of lands, but by the preservation of the men who embodied it. He addressed his army personally, invoking the story of Thermopylae. Men, you have marched farther than any army in memory. You have faced elephants, rivers, deserts, and enemies beyond imagination. Yet the courage you have shown is the same courage that Leonidas and the 300 Spartans displayed centuries ago. They stood against impossible odds, not for glory, not for wealth, but for honor, unity, and the love of their brothers. And so have you. Remember, greatness is not only in victory, but in endurance, in loyalty, in the courage to face what others flee from. We return not in shame, but as men immortalized by our deeds. The speech rekindled a spark in the soldiers. They were exhausted, but they remembered that their suffering, courage, and unity were part of something larger, a continuum of human bravery stretching back to Thermopylae. Lysandros, Pythian, and Androcles, our fictional warriors, stood together, witnessing their comrades nod, some silently shedding tears, others clenching fists in renewed determination. They were more than an army. They were a living testament to the enduring power of courage and loyalty. The march back to Persia and then into Babylon was slower and more measured. Alexander allowed time for recuperation, for tending to wounds, and for reflection. Along the way, he encouraged storytelling. Veterans recounted the sieges, battles, and hardships, but always framed through the lens of Spartan courage. Thermopylae was no longer simply a historical event. It had become a moral compass, a narrative of heroism, sacrifice, and unity that guided every decision. Even the youngest soldiers, previously fearful and inexperienced, internalized the lessons. Fear could be faced, odds could be overcome, and courage could ripple through generations. In Babylon, Alexander reflected privately on the campaign. The empire he had carved across continents was vast, but he knew that empires are fleeting without the human spirit to animate them. The stories of Thermopylae, the discipline, courage, and loyalty exemplified by 300 men centuries earlier, had guided him, shaped his decisions, and inspired his soldiers to accomplish feats that no ordinary army could achieve. The Spartans had taught him that leadership was not simply command. It was presence, example, and the ability to bind individuals into a cohesive, courageous whole. For Lysandros and Pythian, the journey home carried a deeper transformation. They had fought elephants, crossed rivers, scaled walls, and endured hardships no mortal could have imagined. Yet the greatest lesson was internal. Courage is cultivated, unity multiplies power, and legend can inspire action beyond time. They knew that one day, they would tell their own sons and daughters of the battles they fought, of Alexander's campaigns, and of the eternal inspiration drawn from Thermopylae. They understood that history is not merely the record of victories, but the story of human spirit, sacrifice, and resilience. The soldiers returned to Macedon and Greece, weary but alive, their deeds forever bound to legend. Statues, songs, and accounts immortalized Alexander's campaigns. But intertwined with those stories was the essence of Thermopylae, a lesson that courage, discipline, and loyalty could shape history, inspire generations, and transform ordinary men into legends. Centuries later, as historians, poets, and soldiers recounted these events, the narrative of Thermopylae and Alexander's campaigns merged into a single thread of inspiration. They demonstrated that human courage, even in the face of overwhelming odds, could define history more profoundly than wealth, territory, or numbers. Leonidas' 300 Spartans had fallen at a mountain pass, yet their legacy traveled across time, empowering Alexander's armies to cross rivers, defeat empires, and endure hardships that would have broken ordinary men. The story ends with a quiet reflection. On a high hill overlooking a battlefield long ago, one could imagine Leonidas and his warriors standing shoulder to shoulder, their shields locked, facing an impossible tide. Across centuries, Alexander's soldiers, inspired by that courage, faced their own impossible tides. Rivers, elephants, storms, and the vastness of unknown lands. And though each generation fell to time and death, the courage, unity, and discipline they exemplified remained eternal, echoing in every soldier who dares to stand when the world seems against him. Thermopylae was not just a battle. It was a testament to the human spirit, a spark that lit courage across centuries, shaping empires, inspiring legends, and proving that even the smallest force, when united by loyalty, discipline, and bravery, can leave a mark on history that time itself cannot erase. The end.